Tomatoes are one of my favorite topics, and it's partly because everybody likes to grow them and eat them, and partly because they're just fascinating plants historically and botanically and in every other way, ethnobotanically. Um, I always like to start out with a little bit of botany chit chat, just not just for the nerds that among us, but uh, just so that we all are sort of on the same page in thinking about how plants grow and what they need and why we do some of the things we do to encourage them to grow in the way that we want them to grow, which of course isn't always the way that that they would grow if we weren't influencing them in some way. So tomatoes are one of our uh, New World or Western Hemisphere vegetables that have made it around the world after as European explorers came here and took them to Asia first and India and then eventually to Europe and then back here again in colonial times. And they are a tropical to subtropical plant, which means they can't take frost. In the tropics, they're a perennial. They'll last year after year, but here, even in our relatively mild climate, they're an annual. And most of the time here, they don't even make it to the first frost because they usually get destroyed by some kind of disease before they ever get to that frost point, which is in December or January for us. So by the end of November, most tomato plants are so disease riddled and so ugly that you want to tear them out and never see them again, which is fine because then they start up again fresh in the next spring. Our climate is a little bit difficult for tomatoes. Not because our days are too cold, but because our nights are cold. And even in the warm part of the Bay Area, where Kailua is in Contra Costa County, she says it's going to be in the 80s today. And I'm in Marin County, and we're going to be in the 70s today, which is lovely. But our nights are going to fall to around or even a little below 50. And for tomatoes, 55 degrees is sort of the magic cutoff for night temperature uh, because they stop growing and ripening below 55 degrees. And so even in the heat of the summer, our nights often get cool enough that the tomato ripening process stops and then has to wait and start up again the next day when the weather warms up. So we have some uh, special problems that arise because of that and recommendations for how to deal with that. And it varies a lot depending on your particular location, because obviously, if you are closer to the ocean or the bay, your temperatures are going to be a little bit different than if you're in Pleasanton or uh, if you're in Novato. Novato and Pleasanton both being more inland and warmer during the day, but they still share those cooler nights. Um, Closely connected with the idea of temperature for tomatoes is the idea of how long it takes to ripen a tomato. And most tomato starts that you find will have somewhere on the signage or in their little stick tag something that says so many days to harvest or so many days to ripen. And that'll be somewhere between the earliest or about 55 days, and the biggest, latest tomatoes will be in excess of 80 days, which, if you think about it, that's almost 3 months from the point where you set out the little tomato plant to the point where you get the first ripe fruit. And that's with perfect tomato conditions. So since our conditions aren't perfect, even in our warmest climates, um, our ripening process takes longer than it would, say, in the Central Valley, where the nights are warmer. And so your 55-day tomato is probably going to be more like 65 days to ripen. And your 80-day tomato is going to be in excess of 90 days to ripen. And this is why people often say, wow, I've got these big old tomatoes now in October. And yeah, because that's how long it takes for them to finally ripen up, given the way our weather works around here. So for many people, tomatoes that are on the earlier to ripen schedule work better than the tomatoes that are take longer to ripen. And those early ripeners include all of the cherry tomatoes and a whole bunch of varieties that uh, will be small to medium-sized slicing tomatoes, never big beefsteak tomatoes. Those always take a long time. But the smaller ones will ripen up quicker, and we'll go through some varieties and how that works. Soil temperatures are also of great importance, and they warm up much more slowly than the air temperature. And so even though your days might be getting up into the 70s, if you were to stick a thermometer a few inches down into your soil, you'd find that it's probably much closer to 45 to 50 degrees. And that makes it difficult for the roots to grow. And so we come up with some tricks to early in the season to make things seem like they're warmer than they really are. My favorite is to take the small tomato that you buy at the nursery and to put it into a small nursery container, like a 1 gallon or 2 gallon container. And we'll show you this a little later, uh, and let it grow for about 3 weeks to a month in that container. And the reason it is a trick is that it warms up much more during the day. And so it can grow quite a bit faster than it could, the soil warms up, than it could sitting in the ground or in a big raised bed where the soil is going to stay cool as well. And you can also move it around very easily. So you can put it, say, against a south-facing wall of your home where it gets lots of reflected warmth. And if it stays there at night and it's under a little eave, it'll get radiated heat out of the house and out of the soil during the night and stay warmer during the night as well. And so that's a good little trick. There are also little water blankets essentially that you can surround the tomatoes with, and the water warms up and then stays warm and radiates heat during the cooler part of the night, and that's a good trick. You can also cover them at night, and that will retain heat for them. If you're doing this in the ground, that is probably worthwhile. If you're a real early bird, you got to get them in the ground early. Covering them at night is a good idea as well. We talked a little bit about the length to harvest, that they're usually referred to as early season, mid-season, or late season. It's the same as days to harvest. And then this list here is sort of a list of concepts that relate to tomatoes that everybody should be at least a little bit familiar with. Indeterminate versus determinate is the style of growth that particular varieties of tomatoes have. So indeterminate means we can't determine how big it's going to get or when it's going to stop growing. It's a vine, basically. And it will just keep growing throughout the season and keep flowering and keep setting fruit until the weather or disease stops it from doing that. Whereas a determinate tomato uh, gets to a certain size, blooms on all of its branches at the same time, sets the fruit, and ripens it pretty much all at the same time. These are not viney, but more bushy. They're excellent for containers because they don't get crazy on you in terms of their size. But they were developed for machine harvesting, basically, because you didn't want to have to run a machine back through the orchard full of tomato plants 100 times to pick the tomatoes as they slowly ripen one by one. You want to be able to run the machine over to the vines once and pick, you know, 20 or 30 tomatoes, and then that's it for the season. Um, so they will not completely stop producing after that first crop, but it will be slower than it would be with an indeterminate vine, which will keep producing more and more heavily, usually as the season goes on. Heirloom tomatoes are very popular. They're very expensive in the supermarket. Um, and they refer to a couple of characteristics of tomato plants. One is they have to have been around for a length of time, and there's not real agreement on what that length of time is, but it's at least 25 years. And under some definitions, it's 50 years. Um, so it can't be a tomato that somebody just created in their laboratory yesterday. That can never be an heirloom. And the other characteristic of heirlooms is they have to be what's called open pollinated. And that means that they are not a hybrid in the sense that we use the word hybrid in tomato land, where you take the pollen from one plant and you carefully dust it on the flower of another plant to get the characteristics of both of those plants. And that's called an F1 hybrid. Um, Heirlooms have to be allowed to bloom and pollinate themselves or have the bees help them pollinate. And so to get a lot of heirloom seeds, you have to grow a big, big plot of tomatoes, and then you basically take the seeds from the ones in the middle of the plot that are most likely to have self-pollinated, so that year after year you get the same, basically the same tomato. They're what's called stable, uh, open pollinated plants. So things like Cherokee purple, um, or black crim, a couple of the popular heirlooms, are the same year after year, and but they could change. For instance, if you grew them in your own garden and you had several varieties of tomatoes there, and then your neighbor had some, and you took seeds from your black crim that you bought, those seeds could end up being a little bit different because they could have been pollinated by one of the other tomato plant varieties, and then you would have a new variety. Uh, and it would be a hybrid in the sense that we use the term, but it would be an open pollinated hybrid. Anyway, enough of that. Um, Non-GMO is often a characteristic that people want to have in the plants that they're eating. It happens that in Marin County, at least, it is illegal to sell genetically modified plants. Um, you're not going to find any GMO tomato plants in Marin County. I can't speak for the other counties. I don't know what their regulations are, and I'm not aware of any GMO tomatoes on the market, by the way. Um, GMO means that a gene from some other organism has been spliced into the plant. I guess the famous example is a mouse gene put into a plant. That's not going to happen um, anytime soon, and there are lots of good tomato plants out there. You don't have to worry about it. If it's labeled organic, by definition, it cannot be GMO either. So you can, I think, pretty much trust the organic label. Uh, Organic means that it's been certified by some outside organization, either the Department of Agriculture in California or a number of different private organizations that are set up to certify organicness. And it means all the inputs into the plant, the fertilizers, the growing medium, the types of insect control that is used are uh, of non-complicated chemical sources. So for instance, the nitrogen in the fertilizer will come from something like blood meal or feather meal or bat guano or some source, some animal source usually, although there are also vegan fertilizers out there where the nitrogen source will be plant-based. Um, Conventional growing means that it's not certified organic. It's either certified organic or it's conventional. And if somebody says, well, we don't have the certification, but it's grown organically, they're sort of saying, well, yeah, we don't spray and we do all the things that you would do if you were certified, but nobody has certified us. We don't want to spend the money or whatever it is. And so then you're just lacking that third party verification that they are in fact growing these organically. And I'm a supporter of organic growing. I think it is better for the planet. Um, it's better for all of the insect and bird life that surrounds us because we're not flooding the area with pesticides and herbicides in order to grow gigantic crops. As a result, organic farmers almost have to be smaller than the great, huge factory farms. And I think that it ends up being better for the soil because they have to add organic matter into the soil rather than just relying on chemical fertilizers to boost the plant growth and sucking the native nutrition out of the soil. So I go for organic, but it does, but I'm not crazy about it. And uh, if uh, if there aren't organic starts available for a certain variety, I will buy in uh, conventional starts, and you can tell the difference because the organic ones will be labeled organic. Um, Tomatoes come in a couple of funny little varieties, different different named varieties of tomatoes have different shaped leaves, and it's just kind of a funny thing. This is what's called a tomato leaf. So you can see it comes out in, well, the whole leaf is this big thing here, and then it's divided into a bunch of, this is what would be called botanically a pinnate leaf, because it's like a feather. It has a middle rib and then a bunch of leaves that come off of the middle rib. Um, and they all the leaves have these funny little lobes all over them as well. And this is very typical. Most tomatoes have this kind of leaf, and that's why it's called a tomato leaf. But then, whoop, I must have clicked on it. So now I have to get my navigator up here. There we go. Uh, so then There are a few varieties, Brandywine, Visitation Valley, that have what we call a potato leaf. And the reason it's called that, potatoes and tomatoes being very closely related, the leaves on these varieties look much more like a potato plant. And you might even mistake it for a potato if it just came up out of your compost pile or something. You'd say, oh, I'm growing potatoes suddenly. But no, this is another tomato, and it's just the leaves aren't lobed the way the tomato varieties are, tomato leaf varieties are. It still has the central vein and the leaves coming off. It's a pinnate leaf, but it's quite a bit different looking. And I have had people bringing their tomatoes in saying there must be something wrong with it on occasion, and fortunately there isn't, and they go back happy with the fact that they just have a different variety. Um, Now, the earliest of the tomatoes, I mentioned all the cherry tomatoes are quite early and will ripen in almost any climate very successfully. Um, Along the coast, Stupice, I have been told, is one of the pronunciations. I think a lot of people call it Stupus. Um, has been grown for years along the coast because it does very well in the cooler weather. It's a small tomato, but larger than a cherry tomato. It's also a potato leaf variety. And it's very early, so you're looking at, I think the advertised days to harvest is about 55. In reality, it's probably 65. But it's among the very earliest of the tomatoes, and it's usually among the earliest varieties that are available in the nurseries because the growers can have good luck with it early in the season as well. Most of you may already be familiar with the name Early Girl. It's a very early F1 hybrid tomato. It's a small slicing tomato, maybe 2 to 2.5 inches in diameter. Quite tasty for a modern tomato, and not an heirloom because it's a hybrid. Although it's been around for quite a while, and most people can grow it quite successfully. Um, I wanted to talk a little about Dirty Girl. I only know one grower, a Flatland Flower Farm in the area that grows Dirty Girl for distribution. But uh, the grower of or the owner of Early Girl used to be Monsanto. They sold it to somebody else now, I think. But a lot of the farmers don't like Monsanto because of the influence they have and the fact they tie their seeds to pesticides and things like that. But regardless of the politics of it, Dirty Girl Farms down near Santa Cruz grew out a bunch of early girls and then just let them pollinate themselves and grew the seeds from those and then did it again generation after generation until they had grown essentially an open pollinated small early slicer that was originally derived from Early Girl. It's not Early Girl. It's got Early Girl genes in it, but it's called Dirty Girl. And if you see it, it's a good tomato. It's not entirely stable yet, even though it's gone through several years of generations. The open pollinated process means that if you buy 6 Dirty Girls, they're all going to be just very slightly different. And some will probably be a little earlier, some a little larger than others. And it's kind of an interesting process. You can see how the open pollinated world works and how it takes a long time to become an heirloom that's stable and where you can say, okay, my black crim is going to look like a black crim and taste like one. Sun gold, uh, I always tell people if you're only going to grow one tomato in your life, grow sun gold. And that's for several reasons. It's a golden orange cherry tomato. Actually, here's a picture of a bowl of sun golds. Um, it's a lovely, sweet, with just a touch of acidity. It grows like a weed. The largest tomato in the world, the last time I looked at the Guinness Book of World Records, was a sun gold vine that had completely covered a giant grape arbor, and was just out of this world huge. Probably not anywhere around here. But Sun Gold is an excellent early variety. If you like a red cherry tomato for early days, Super Sweet 100 is one of my favorites. It's a nice, small, round red cherry tomato. And one of my favorite tomatoes to grow, period, is Juliet. It's a grape-shaped, oblong, small tomato, which is quite solid. Most of the cherry tomatoes, when you bite into them, they kind of go poof in your mouth and they're very wet. Juliet is a little more solid for a small tomato. And as a result, you can slice it, and it'll make these nice little rounds to throw into a salad or something like that, rather than having a half a cherry tomato, which is kind of gooping all over your salad. You can make nice rounds of Juliet that will stay intact. So it's maybe in texture, it's just a little bit more like a paste tomato, uh, but it's very delicious and I highly recommend it. So Sun Gold, we now know. Austin's Red Pear is one that became available a few years ago. I don't know how old it really is, but we've had very good luck with it. And they're fairly good sized, pear shaped, very red, very tasty, and just again grow like gangbusters for most of us. This is Stupice, which we talked about. You note the sign says it's from Czechoslovakia. A lot of the early tomatoes are from Eastern Europe. And it's not that their climate's just like ours. Their nights are actually, during the summer, are warmer than ours are. Um, but they have a short growing season. The spring comes later and the fall comes earlier. And as a result, the tomatoes that do well there have are early tomatoes because they have to ripen early and get done before the cold weather comes. And so many of the tomatoes that are early and that work well in the Bay Area have names that relate in some way to Eastern Europe or to even Nordic countries or Russia or someplace where the climate says it's going to be a short season rather than a long, warm night season. The long, warm night seasons are you get tomatoes like that come primarily from the American Midwest and South, and the Central Valley of California. But if they say Florida giant on them, don't don't try to grow it. It's not going to work for you. I was a little disappointed when I went to this. What's the big seed company in Petaluma or Santa Rosa? Anyway, I went there and they had thousands and thousands of different kinds of seeds, but most of them weren't designed for West Coast gardening. They were from other places where the seasons are different. So it's a little bit important to kind of pick your varieties for your climate if you want to be happy with what's going on. Um, Now, there aren't too many determinate varieties available usually when you're shopping for tomatoes, but Bush Early Girl is one of them. And just about any variety that has the name Bush in it, like, excuse me, I think there's a Bush Better Boy. There are Bush 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 put in front of the names of other varieties, basically, where they've either developed the variety out of that older one or something, or it seems similar to it, something like that. But a bush early girl is a nice determinate small slicer, and does very well in containers. And it's another F1 hybrid. It has hybrid disease resistance and is a good choice if you want a determinate tomato rather than an indeterminate one. Visitation Valley is one of my favorites. It's hard to find except early in the season, unfortunately. But if you happen to see it, grab it. This is what I would call a semi-determinate plant. It'll get up 3 feet or so, but then it'll stop. So again, it's excellent for containers, but it'll do great in the ground. It has good old-timey flavor. It's a real heirloom, so it's old. And I think just about anybody will enjoy growing and eating Visitation Valley. You can see they've used the Spanish spelling there for visitation, but not for valley. That's interesting. Campari is basically, if you've been in the supermarket and seen the cluster tomatoes there, that's what Campari is. It's a cluster tomato. And it's quite good. But it's probably not going to cluster quite the way you see in the store because they're growing those in greenhouses under very controlled conditions. But they will make you these nice groups of 8 or 9 tomatoes on a flowering stem. And if they all happen to ripen at once, you can cut them off and bring them into the kitchen all at once, and then you better start eating them real fast because they won't last forever that way. And you don't want to store your tomatoes in the refrigerator. Well, until you've cut them, and then you kind of have to. Now, we'll get into what we need to do for planting tomatoes. Tomatoes are plants that are very hungry and very thirsty. They need a very fertile soil, and that means lots of organic matter and some fertilizer in addition. In the ground, I usually recommend that people use a combination of compost and manure. Chicken manure gives you the most bang for the buck, or for the volume that you're buying, and it's barely more expensive than steer manure. But steer manure will work fine as well. And if you are a person who has access to manure that's fresh, like from a friend who has a horse or something like that, make sure that you dig that in. I wouldn't use it in a container, and I would want it at a below ground level, because you shouldn't be using your hands in the manure and then fiddling with the tomatoes later on. This is not hygienic. If you want to compost the manure, the fresh manure, or put it out on your beds in the late fall and let it decompose until spring, that'll work fine, and then you don't have to worry about it. But fresh manure doesn't belong right on the food. Doesn't belong on the lettuce, for instance, either. In containers, you want to start with a good quality potting soil. And you can kind of tell by the bag of potting soil will list its ingredients. And if it only has like 2 ingredients, bark and sand, that's not a good potting soil. And that's a little bit of a joke. None of them are that bad. But the idea is that they should have, they'll all, in the Western United States, they all start with bark. They might have a little peat moss in them. They might have some coir in them these days. Um, they should have some kind of compost, which could be, it might say compost, it might say, oh, grape or apple pumice is a type of compost. And then it'll have some kind of real fertility elements in it, such as, um, you know, manure or um, blood meal or something like that, that'll make it a little more fertile. But they don't list their fertilizer elements, so they're not guaranteeing any particular balance of fertilizer in the potting soil. So I like to use a well-balanced fertilizer as well added to my potting soil, or if I'm planting in the ground after I have mixed in compost and manure at about the rate of maybe 3 or 4 parts compost to 1 part manure. Then I like to add an organic balanced fertilizer. Balanced means the three big numbers, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, are going to be roughly equal. So 555 would be exactly equal, and that's 5% of each by weight in the bag. Um, so you can tell only 15% of the bag is fertilizer, the rest is filler. Um, but 463 would be balanced, or 546 would be balanced, close enough. But I wouldn't want to use 711, for instance, which is basically all nitrogen in the fertilizer part. So a balanced fertilizer, I like it to have at least 3% calcium in it, because
Hey,
most,
Dan,
yes.
while you're on this topic, can you think of any of the fertilizers that we carry that have this 3% calcium and kind of balance? The one I'm thinking of is tomato tone, and maybe the down to earth all purpose.
Uh, the good news is that most of the fertilizers that Sloat carries has the 3% calcium. Um, all of the EB Stone organic fertilizers that we carry, such as the tomato vegetable or the all-purpose or the rosenflower food, those all have plenty of calcium in them and they're nicely balanced. The Down to Earth line has lots of calcium in it. They have a really good vegetable fertilizer. Their BioLive is a really nice fertilizer that has additional uh, bacteria and fungi in it. Although, as a shout out to the EB Stone fertilizers, for a long time, for many, many years, they have had the additional fungi and bacteria as well that are helpful for the plants.
Mhm.
So, fortunately, we're all used to reading the ingredients at the grocery store, and we can do the same thing at the nursery, and it will tell you calcium is one of the listed elements, and it'll tell you the percentage in the fertilizer. Um, and then it's important to think about the support for the plants, because the indeterminate tomatoes, if you don't support them, will just sprawl all around the ground. The tomatoes will be laying on the ground. The earwigs and the like will start munching on them, and fungi and bacteria will get at them before they even ripen. And so it's good to keep them up in the air. So uh, tomato cages, there's a little video clip here I'll show you that shows a tomato cage. They work great, but you have to get them on at the beginning. You can't put a tomato cage around a tomato that's been growing in the ground for a month or in a container for a month and is sprawling everywhere, and then you're just going to break it into pieces as you try to jam the tomato cage down around it. And so if that happens, and it often does, we forget about it or we don't want to bother with it at the beginning when they're tiny, you can always get some simple bamboo stakes that are maybe 4 feet tall is a good general size. And just stick those in as you need to and tie the little tomato branches to them. Or sometimes I just make 3 or 4 or 5 stakes around the tomato and then tie string around in a circle to keep the tomato in. And it's sort of like making your own tomato cage, but you can do it after the fact if you need to. So, not the end of the world if you don't get the tomato cage in at the beginning, but it's much easier if you do. And then watering for tomatoes is different in the ground than in containers. In the ground, you are shooting to go very deep and not very often so that the tomato roots go down deep and you don't have to water nearly as often. You should be able to get to the point where obviously, when it's tiny, you're going to have to do it more than once a week, maybe 2 to 3 times a week, but you're going to be backing off as the roots go down, and you should be able to get to the point where you only have to water once a week. But that means a soak. It doesn't mean a little sprinkle on top of the soil. You want to put the hose there at the base of the tomato and just let it run for a while so that it gets down nice and deep. In a container, you don't have deep. And even if you do, if you're in one of these very tall, skinny pots, the fact is that the plant is never going to use the bottom half of that pot. It stays too wet and there isn't enough oxygen in the soil, and there's just no way to get it there. Um, this is one of the reasons that orchid pots, for instance, have all these holes around the sides and slits and things like that, is to get oxygen in there to the roots. And a solid container just doesn't do that. And even a terracotta breathes. No, not in that sense. So the only oxygen that gets down there is what goes down with the water, basically. And deep, deep, deep pots do not function as, the same volume pot as a wider, shallower pot does. Uh, but as a result, generally speaking, your tomatoes, as they grow, are going to dry out much faster than the ones in the ground, and you're going to have to water, at least 2 to 3 times a week as the plant gets bigger. And in a heat wave, you may be watering daily. Um, Most of the plants in a plant nursery at the slotes get watered daily during the summer, unless they're in real shade or there's been a super foggy day where the sun never really comes out. But daily watering is typical. Now we're going to have a little video demonstration here of planting up your little 3.5 inch tomato into the 1 gallon size container that I mentioned to you. And you may not have to do this now that we're a little further along in the season, but it's never a bad idea, and it's always a good idea earlier in the season when we're a little cooler. And I would say in cooler parts of the area, San Francisco, maybe Western Marin County, any place close to the bay, this would still be a good idea to do even now. Uh, and if you have, dogs stomping around in your garden or kids stomping around in your garden, it's probably a good idea to grow your plants up a little bit like this as well so that they're a little tougher by the time they get in the ground. Okay, here's a
Hey,
little video.
Dan, real quick before you start that video, I'm seeing a
Yeah,
couple questions popping up right now.
let's
So I've got one person asking if 25-gallon canvas pots are good for oxygen.
Um, yes, they're going to be better. Not so much because they're canvas, but just
Mm-hmm.
because a 25-gallon canvas pot is going to be roughly square, if we think
Mm-hmm.
about it. Sort of the same width as depth, more
That
or
makes
less. And that's a good geometry for getting oxygen into the soil. So yes, and that's a size where you can grow a couple of tomatoes in a 20, if you want to, in a 25-gallon. That's a good big container. Yeah.
Okay. Another one is on the note of watering. I've got someone who has a drip system that would like to know about how much water at the one time per week.
Okay, so this is for in the ground then, I assume.
It
Uh,
sounds like it.
and if you have the typical drip system, you're going to have to run it for at least half an hour um, in order to get enough water deep. Um,
Hmm.
but drip systems, it depends so much on the emitter that you're using. If you're using the coil kind of hose with numerous emitters on it around the plant, they give out
Hmm.
more water and more evenly. I like those than either the spray emitters or the little drop emitters where you'd have to have 4 or 5 of them around to do the same job.
Hmm.
But I would say run it for half an hour, wait a day, and then dig down and see what it did. And if the water has gone down 6 inches or more, then you're doing well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good note for all drip watering, actually.
Yeah.
So,
Well, drip is tricky because people want to set it and forget it, and you cannot do that with drip irrigation. You've got to check that the water's going where you want it to go because there's not very much water coming out. So if it's not getting into the root zone well, it's not doing you or the plants any good at all. So you got to keep checking it.
all right. I will let you finish your video there.
All right, we're going to start our little video here. Click, click. We're going to plant a 3.5-inch tomato into a 1-gallon can. Keep the label, tap it out, rough up the root ball. I like to use the corner of the label, nice and sharp. Put it in at a level in the soil where the new soil is going to come up about an inch or an inch and a half up on the stem. I've added a little bit of slow vegetable tomato or tomato vegetable fertilizer by EB Stone. Leave about an inch of can above the soil line for watering. Give it a little tap down. Put the label back in. And voila. All right, so that is planting a little one into a slightly larger one. And I mentioned before, I like to go 3 to 4 weeks in that gallon can. The roots will fill it up and it'll be quite a bit bigger. Um, I like to use a small bamboo stake as well. Didn't show that in the video, but I would tie a little bamboo stake on it just to make sure it doesn't get broken off. And away we go. Um, in containers, I like the 15-gallon sized container for growing a tomato for the whole season. You can grow them in a smaller container and they'll do fine for a while, but they'll fill it up and they'll use up all the good stuff in the soil pretty quickly. And by halfway through the season, they'll be struggling. In a 15-gallon container, you can put a tomato cage and you got about 2 cubic feet of soil, which is a full big bag of soil, and they'll do just great. More and more, there are tomatoes labeled as dwarf varieties, and they may be dwarf brandywine or dwarf this or dwarf that, dwarf the other, but they are in fact smaller plants. They're not necessarily determinate plants. They may be indeterminate, but they're just slow growing and smaller and they're good for smaller containers. So I would say about 5 gallons of volume is about the smallest that you will have good success in, even with these smaller plants. Um, and again, the good quality potting soil with a container and the fertilizer with calcium and then some kind of support. If it's a smaller container, you won't be able to put a big tomato cage in it. There are smaller cages we call pepper cages that work fine for smaller containers, and they'll do some good. And then just get the package of bamboo stakes and use them liberally and a little bit of tie tape, and you got it. Now here we have magically grown that 1 gallon container into a big plant, and somehow we've transformed the black can into a purple one. That's pure magic. But we're going to plant it into a 15-gallon container. Now we're going to plant the 1 gallon tomato that grew up from the 3.5-inch tomato into its forever home, the 15-gallon container. And the process is very similar. We keep the label, tap it out. Now again, we're going to scratch up the root ball lightly. And again, I can just use the corner of the label. That'll do. And then, unlike when I planted the 3.5-inch one, this one doesn't have to go down deeper than the root ball is here. It's already made extra roots on the stem from the first time we transplanted it. So it's just going to go right in, pretty much at the same level as the soil here. Won't hurt if it's a little deeper, but you're not going to get much in the way of new roots at this point. And snug it in there. And now, since this is an indeterminate tomato that's just going to keep growing, this is Better Boy, I'm going to put a tomato cage on before it gets much bigger. This is a typical cage. I got a red one so it would show up more in the video, but they have this strange angle of the legs, and I'm going to straighten those out just a little bit so they'll go into the soil nicely. Place it around the tomato and just work it down. And then the tomato will be able to grow up through the tomato cage and be supported. And there we have it. All right. Just, I don't think I mentioned it, but the reason we scratch up the root ball like that is twofold. One is that we are breaking the pattern that the roots make when they get to the edge of the container and they kind of start growing around, maybe not circling around, but they start to grow in the direction of the edge of the container because they can't go any further. And so we're kind of breaking up that pattern so they'll have to grow out into the new soil that we're putting them in. And we're also creating more surface area on that smooth root ball that came out of the container. And that's kind of important because by making all the little cuts in the soil, the new soil has lots of little nooks and crannies to go together with, kind of like your fingers going like this, rather than your hands just going together like this, where they're against each other, but they're not interlinking. So we're making lots of little places for the new soil to interlink. And it really helps for water transmission and for allowing the roots to grow out into the new soil. So you don't have to mangle the roots in any way, but it is good to disturb the pattern a bit and make more surface area. Now, mid-season tomatoes will be the 70 to 80-day tomatoes, and they'll be mid-sized. You don't see any cherry tomatoes on this list. These are all medium-sized slicers, with the exception of Celebrity's a little larger. And But Visitation Valley, Petaluma Hill Purple is a lovely uh, cross that was done that has purple shoulders and kind of darker inside. Baby wine is a small version of brandy wine. Brandy wine is a big old heirloom that is a perennial taste test winner, but a little challenging to grow around here. But baby wine is kind of the small version of it. And Celebrity and Ace have both been around a long time and seem to do well in our gardens for mid-season varieties. Um, this is Sebastopol, which is another just into the mid-season at 70 days, another Eastern European variety. And this is Petaluma Hill Purple. You can see the kind of the dark inside here. It is progeny of Cherokee Purple, which is one of the older more beautiful heirlooms that we have available to us. San Francisco Fog is the tomato that, for me, gets the award for best name. Um, I don't think it's necessarily the perfect tasting tomato, but it is a good one to grow in the cooler areas. It was developed for growing in coastal climates and is reliable in the coastal, along with Stupice. Um, Bigger, older, or bigger, longer ripening varieties, Brandywine, Big Boy, Better Boy. Uh, the Costalutos are lovely Italian tomatoes. If you can find one of those, grow it. If you've got a warm spot. They're fluted edges and very large, and look wonderful when you slice them to put them on a hamburger or something like that. Among the newer tomatoes are a whole series that they call heirloom marriage. And what they've done is taken old heirloom tomatoes, taken two of them and hybridized them together. So by definition, these are not heirlooms because they are man-made hybrids um, that are they keep hybridizing them to make the seeds. They're not open pollinated, but they are progeny of heirlooms. They have a lot of the heirloom characteristics, flavor-wise, and they have a lot of the hybrid vigor and hybrid disease resistance that we look for from time to time. So look for those. And they'll say heirloom marriage, genuine. That's a cross between, um, I don't know what the genu is off top of my head, but the wine is brandy wine. Um, and then Berkeley tie-dye is a beautiful, locally produced, um, large later tomato that is very popular these days with people. There's also a dwarf Berkeley tie-dye that's available. This is a picture of brandy wine. This is just one of the great tomatoes that's ever been developed. And again, can be challenging to grow. This is the Costaluto, and you can see the fluting around the tomato that's natural and makes it really interesting when you slice it. This is and don't tell us on the sign, do they, what the genu is? I just can't think of what that is. But this is one of the heirloom marriages. And again, you can see nice big tomato. It's got the kind of brandy wine color and probably some of the flavor characteristics. This one is a cross between Cherokee Purple and Carbon. Those are both wonderful heirlooms. This has the characteristic dark shoulders of Cherokee purple and some of the purple coloring that both carbon and Cherokee purple have. Um, this is Berkeley tie-dye. There are two varieties. This is Berkeley tie-dye pink, and there's I think it's a green variety as well. Um, Fabulous tomato. Um, we always have to talk about problems with tomatoes. Tomatoes are subject to a number of different problems that are most of them are fungal. Both of the blights, Septoria, Fusarium, and Verticillium, are all fungal diseases. Um, Fusarium and Verticillium are soil-borne diseases. And so if you confirm that you have had either of those, you don't want to grow your tomatoes in that area again. And if you had them in a container, you don't want to use the same soil that was in that container. Uh, the blights and the septoria are airborne funguses. You don't have much control over whether they arrive in your garden or not. Um, Generally speaking, you will not have either of the blights. Um, but sometimes they will be common in a neighborhood, especially if somebody has grown tomatoes, say year after year, and not taken good care of the garden after the season. So they've let the tomato vines rot in place, or they have home composted them and not done a good hot composting with them, and then grown tomatoes again, and then you can get it sailing through the air over the fence into your yard. So the best thing you can do is to do good hygiene with your plants. When you're finished with the season, cut the plants off. You don't have to worry about the roots. Cut the plants off, put them in your green can. Don't compost them at home. The green can people will compost them at high temperature that will destroy all the pathogens. Your home compost will probably not get hot enough consistently enough to do that. So I don't recommend that you compost tomatoes or potatoes at home. Um, Septoria leaf spot can be controlled to some extent by biologic fungicides, something like Monterey Complete Disease Control. It's a bacteria which acts as a fungicide, and it can have some good effect if you happen to see Septoria. You can look if you look on the outline that was on our Sloat website for this program, you'll see a reference to the UC Davis Integrated Pest Management website. And that is a wonderful resource. If you think you have a disease, go there, find the kind of the homeowner gardener portal, and you'll be able to look by plant type and get some really good photo identifications for different things. And of course, you can always bring samples into your local garden center, and we will try to help you in that way as well. The principal insects are tomato hornworms, which are gigantic green caterpillars which eat your tomatoes. And you never see them until you go to pick the tomato and you turn it over, and either there's this gigantic caterpillar sitting right there in your face, or half the tomato is gone, and the worm is gone too. They're related to tobacco hornworms, and they come from a great ginormous moth, which is really wonderful. Really the best thing to do is just, if you once you know you got them, go out and hand pick them and get rid of them, and throw them in your neighbor's yard over the fence if they don't have tomatoes, and the birds will eat them. And then aphids do attack tomatoes, and if early in the season is usually the problem, and you can use a hard stream of water and just blast them off regularly, or something kind of simple like horticultural soap. Insecticidal soap does a great job on aphids. You just have to disrupt their little breeding colony, and you'll keep them at a dull roar. They don't do very much damage. There's also a cultural phenomenon that happens, well, numerous of them, but the most disturbing is called blossom end rot on a tomato, where the flower grows and then out here, and then the tomato grows here, and the stem is here. The flower drops off, and sometimes you get this big kind of brown scabby thing, gray brown scab growing where the flower was. And it's a cultural problem, not an insect or disease problem. And it has to do with the plant not taking up enough calcium. And it's one of the reasons we recommend you have plenty of calcium available to the plant, just so that you know it's there. It can still happen, especially early in the season, that the first few tomatoes will get blossom end rot. And then a little later in the season, it won't happen. And it has to do with soil temperature mostly, that the plant's not absorbing the calcium yet. Calcium's there, it's just not able to use it yet. And so you get the problem early in the season. So I tell people, not, don't panic. Probably it's going to get better. And there are foliar calcium sprays that are available. I frankly don't know for sure that that's the pathway that the calcium gets into the plant. Um, but it, I know it's not going to hurt, and they claim that it gets into the plant that way. So you can find that at your garden center. It's just a calcium spray. Um, Now, there's a school of thought out there. This is kind of almost an aside, but there's a school of thought that says take all the suckers off of the plant that are below the first flower. And I think the reasoning might be that you want all the energy of the plant going into those flowers and making the fruit. My personal view is this is false reasoning, that what you really want is the plant to make as many leaves as possible, to make as much food and sugar and protein to go into the growth of the plant, the flowers, and the fruit. But I'm going to show you what the suckers are in this video, and how to remove them, and how to find the first flowers, so that if you adopt that style of growing, you know what we're talking about, or at least what the people who talk about that are talking about.
Now we're going to talk about what people call suckers on the tomato plant. Suckers are really just branches, but there is a school of thought out there that says something like all the suckers below the first flowers should be removed. And you can do that. I don't personally do that, but I want to show you what the branches or suckers are, and you can decide on your own strategy. So this one shows them very clearly. At every leaf, there's going to be a growth of a new branch, which is called the sucker by some people. And if I were going to go by the nothing below the first flowers, then the first flowers are forming here, and I would remove all the so-called suckers below. And they come off very easily, just like that. Personally, I just thin out any growth like that that I think is too thick or is growing in a direction that I don't want. Otherwise, the suckers become branches that have flowers on them, and they make fruit just like the whole rest of the plant, because it's just part of the plant.
Okay. I felt I was on a soapbox there. Uh, Now, this is just a little review of best practices that we should have in mind, I think. Um, if we can rotate locations in the garden, if we're have enough space to do that, it's a good idea. So if you grew tomatoes on the left side of the garden last year, grow them on the right side of the garden this year, is all that means. If you're growing in containers, it's real easy to replace the soil. Use the old soil for something else, replace the soil for the tomatoes, and then we avoid any likelihood of soil-borne problems. Also, uh, you'll get a lot more nutrition in the new soil. And if you're going to use old soil, you need to add the things that decompose, which are the compost and the manure type of things. Never plant where potatoes have been grown, and never plant potatoes where tomatoes have been grown. This is just a recipe for the Irish potato famine, or the American tomato famine, as it might be. We talked about not composting at home. Uh, Enough space for good air circulation. This is kind of important. Um, a lot of these of the problems that we have are because water stays on the leaves as the night gets cooler, and that's just a perfect place for some funguses and bacteria to grow. So enough space for good air circulation means that things can dry out by evening. And by the same token, we want to water at the base, down on the ground or in the pot, not up on the leaves. We don't want to shower the plant because that just moves spores of funguses around, and it creates more likely places for them to grow. And if we can, we want to water in the morning, because then by the evening, the ground has dried and the leaves have dried, and they stay dry during the cooler evening. And then we want to fertilize during the growing season, not just once. We want to get them fertilizer in the soil at the time of planting, but uh, in the ground or in containers, you want to keep fertilizing through the season, because in order to keep producing, tomatoes have to keep growing rapidly. It's not like a plum tree or something where it sends out one flush of growth, makes flowers, gives you a crop. These are a vine that keeps growing, keeps flowering as it goes, keeps setting tomatoes, ripening tomatoes all through the season. And so it needs fertilizer as it goes. Uh, Now, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Do you have
And
questions?
yeah, I was gonna say before you wrap up, there were a couple good questions sitting here in the Q&A. Two of them are pretty closely related, so I'm gonna see if I can phrase them in one, which is essentially, can you advise on both companion planting and saving your plants from neighborhood animals?
Mhm. Yeah. Um, Companion planting really means planting other plants that will have some synergistic effect with the crop that you're interested in. Uh, Basil has been a traditional companion plant for tomatoes, and I think it's not just because people wanted to make caprese salads. Um, the odor from the basil may confuse insects that are coming in, and so that's a good, and they like the same kinds of situation, nice, warm, sunny spot. Um, I always recommend people grow sweet alyssum in their vegetable garden wherever they can, because it attracts a wonderful group of insects called hoverflies. And hoverflies do a little bit of pollinating, but more importantly, they have larvae that eat all kinds of soft-bodied insects, pests. And so grow lots of those. And then just other simple open-looking flowers that will attract pollinators to the garden. Anything that attracts pollinators attracts other good insects as well that will help you control insects. As far as marauding neighborhood animals, I assume we're talking about wild animals here.
Yeah, most of what I'm seeing was like squirrels and the
Yeah.
like.
Um, um, you know, uh, netting and fencing are the basic tools. You can use deterrents. Most of those are not toxic to humans. Some of them are capsaicin based, hot pepper. You probably don't want to use the rotten egg based ones on your vegetables because they smell to high heaven and probably aren't listed for eating. They have what are called putrescent egg solids in them, which is enough to put you off your feed for a week. Um, but I think fencing and netting really is the answer. And the good news is most of the wild animals don't do too much to your tomato plants. I have had some problems with rats. Um, and they don't eat the plants, but they have bothered the fruit. Um, I don't. I have lots of squirrels around my house, but I don't have a problem with them taking tomatoes. Um, so I think fencing and netting is really your answer, and a certain amount of deterrence with maybe pepper sprays if you have a mammal that's trying to actually eat things. Pepper is pretty good against mammals.
All right. Well, that was the majority of the questions. But let's see, is there anything I can think of that I've been curious about? Hmm. No, not really. You've answered a lot of good
Well,
questions today. Got a lot of cool varieties of tomatoes that I am eager to try.
good try. And oh, I will do a little shout out for there are a couple of companion planting videos available on the website or the YouTube channel.
Hmm.
And I think they cover quite a bit of why you use companion plants and what good ones are. And there's also a good companion plant listing on the Sloat website. I think if you just search for companion plants, you'll run across a sheet you can print off that's quite informative. Yeah.
Hmm.
So thank you all.
I
Appreciate
agree.
your being here on this beautiful day and get out there in the garden now.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us and happy spring. Bye now.
I know.